The year is 872. Styrbjorn stands in the half-darkness of his workshop in Hedeby. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. Outside, the sounds of the bustling trade town are a distant hum. Inside, there is only the roar of the forge, the hiss of the quench tub, and the rhythm of his hammer. Before him on the anvil lies the work of a full moon cycle. A sword blade for Jarl Olafsson? Not just any blade. It is a serpent forged in fire. It began as 7 separate rods. 4 were of soft, pliable iron, painstakingly refined from the spongy bloom of his own furnace. This iron gave a sword its soul, its ability to bend and not break. 3 rods were steel. He had made this himself, packing iron bars in a clay coffin with crushed bone and charcoal, and leaving it to cook in the embers for 3 days. This steel gave a sword its bite. Its edge would not dull on a shield or a helm. Styrbjorn heated these 7 rods until they glowed like the setting sun. He hammered them together into a single, solid bar. Then the real work started. He heated the bar again, gripped one end in the vise, and twisted the other with heavy tongs. He twisted it tight, the light and dark metals spiraling around each other. He hammered it flat. He twisted it again the other way. He hammered it flat again. He did this until the patterns inside the metal were finer than a spider's web. This was the core of the blade, the beautiful, deadly heart. He forged 2 more bars of his precious steel. These would be the edges. He laid them along the sides of the patterned core, a sandwich of hard and soft. He used a special flux of sand and borax bought from a trader to make the metals join. He brought the entire assembly to a blinding white heat. The moment had to be perfect. Too cold and the weld would fail. The blade would fly apart on the first blow. Too hot and the steel would burn, becoming brittle and useless. He watched the color. He felt the heat on his face. He listened to the sound of the fire. He pulled the glowing bar from the forge. Sparks flew like angry spirits. He laid it on the anvil and struck, not with anger, but with precision. His hammer, an extension of his arm, fell again and again. The sound was a sharp, clear ring. The sound of a good weld. The sound of steel being born. He worked quickly, drawing the bar out, shaping the point, tapering the edges. For an hour, he and the fire and the steel were one thing. Finally, the shape was there, a long, elegant blade. But its inner beauty was still hidden, masked by fire scale and hammer marks. He would spend the next week grinding and polishing it with stones and sand, slowly revealing the intricate, watery patterns he had twisted into its core. Well, the serpent would awaken. This was pattern welding. It was not magic. It was knowledge. It was sweat. It was 100 small secrets passed from master to apprentice that turned rock and fire into a legend. Number 18A Smith's work began not with fire, but with water. Old Halston did not work with fire. His tools were a long ash pole and his own 2 feet. He lived near the swamps west of Reeb in the year 810. For most of the year, he was a farmer, like everyone else. But in the late summer, when the crops were in and the water was low, he became a seeker. He sought iron. He would walk the edges of the bogs and marshes for days. He was looking for a specific reddish-brown scum on the surface of the still water. It was a sign. The water itself told him where the iron was hiding. He carried a sack made of hide. He would wade into the shallow, tea-colored water, the cold mud sucking at his legs. He used the pole to feel for the bottom. Not the soft peat, but something harder. He was searching for nodules, lumpy formations that felt like stones buried in the muck. When the pole hit one with a dull thud, he would drop the pole and dig with his hands and feet. He would pull up a dripping, mud-covered lump. It looked like a rust-colored rock. This was bog iron. It was born from iron-rich groundwater that seeped into the peat. Or bacteria in the bog caused the iron to precipitate out of the water, forming these solid deposits over many years. It was slow work. On a good day, Halston might fill his sack, maybe 40 pounds of wet ore. He would haul it back to his farmstead and pile it near his hut. He had to gather a huge amount. A single smelt, one that might produce a 10-pound bloom of usable iron, required over 200 pounds of this raw ore. It took him weeks of waiting and digging to gather enough for a single firing of the local furnace. He did not own the furnace. It was a shared resource for the village. The smith, Eric, would give Halston a share of the finished iron for his labor. Sometimes he got a new knife or an axe head. Once gathered, the ore had to be prepared. Halston would build a large fire and roast the nodules. This process did more than just dry them out. The heat cracked the rocks, making them easier to break into smaller, fist-sized pieces. It also burned away some of the organic material from the peat. The smell was acrid, a mix of wood smoke and burning earth. This step was crucial. Unroasted ore would not smelt properly. The fire in the furnace would struggle to reach the right heat. Halston's work was the first secret. A good blade did not start in the forge. It started here in the cold, quiet water of the bog. Without men like Halston, there would be no iron, no axes, no nails, no swords. The entire Viking world was built on the patient work of finding these rusty stones hidden in the mud. Number 17, the forest gave the fire its true power. In the deep woods of Vestfold around 850, a man named Bjorn and his 2 sons spent their autumns making charcoal. They were not smiths, but their work was just as important. Iron could not be smelted with a simple wood fire. Their wood burned too quickly and not hot enough. It contained too much water and impurities. To reach the temperatures needed to turn ore into iron, a smith needed charcoal. And not just any charcoal, he needed the best. Bjorn selected his trees with care. He preferred hardwoods. Oak, beech, and birch were his favorites. They produced a dense, heavy charcoal that burned long and hot. He would spend weeks felling the trees and cutting the logs into manageable lengths, about as long as a man's arm. This was hard, physical labor. The sound of their axes echoed through the silent forest. They stacked the wood in a clearing they had used for generations. The next step was building the kiln. It was not a building, but a carefully constructed mound called a clamp. They started by driving a stake into the center of the clearing. They leaned 3 logs against it to form a small chimney. Then they began stacking the rest of the wood on end, radiating out from the center, packing it as tightly as possible. They built layer upon layer, creating a large dome-shaped pile that could be 15 feet across and 7 feet high. A single mound contained enough wood to supply the local smith for half the year. Once the mound was built, they covered it completely. They used a layer of leaves and moss, and then on top of that, a thick coating of earth and turf, leaving only the small chimney at the top and a small opening at the base. Bjorn would then light a fire in the opening at the bottom. Once the wood inside was burning well, he sealed the opening. The process was now about controlling the air. The wood could not be allowed to burn with open flame. It needed to smolder, to bake in its own heat with very little oxygen. This was called pyrolysis. It burned off the water, tar, and gases in the wood, leaving behind almost pure carbon. For the next week, Bjorn and his sons watched the mound day and night. They never left it. They watched the color of the smoke coming from small vents they had made. White smoke meant there was still water burning off. Yellow, acrid smoke meant the tars were burning. When the smoke turned a thin, clear blue, the process was nearly complete. They had to be careful. If part of the mound got too much air, it would burst into flame and ruin the charcoal. If a section collapsed, they had to quickly patch it with more turf. After about 7 to 10 days, the smoke would stop. They then sealed all the vents and let the mound cool for another 2 days. Opening it too soon would cause the hot charcoal to ignite in the open air. When they finally broke open the cooled mound, the inside was full of black, lightweight pieces of wood. It looked like the charred remains of a fire, but it was different. When Bjorn tapped a piece of good charcoal, it made a sharp, metallic clinking sound. Bad charcoal, made from soft wood or burned too quickly, made a dull thud. He knew the difference. He knew the smith would pay a high price for the clinking kind. This fuel was the lifeblood of the forge. A single sword could consume over 100 pounds of it. The secret was not just the fire, but the fuel that made the fire special. Number 16, the furnace was a beast that breathed in and breathed out. Ketil was the master smith in his village, located up a fjord from Kopang around the year 890. His most important tool was not his hammer, but his furnace. It was a simple thing, really. A clay and stone chimney about 4 feet tall and wider at the base. And he built it himself every spring using clay from the riverbank mixed with sand and chopped straw. He built it against a low stone wall for support. It had an opening at the bottom to tap the slag and remove the bloom, and a hole near the top where the smoke and flame escaped. The furnace was a hungry beast. Before a smelt, Kettle and his apprentices would spend 2 days preparing. They crushed the roasted bog iron ore into pieces no bigger than a nut. They broke the charcoal into similar-sized chunks. The day of the smelt, they began by lighting a fire in the bottom of the furnace and letting it burn for hours. The goal was to slowly heat the clay walls until they glowed. A cold furnace would chill the smelt and ruin the process. Once the furnace was hot, the real work began. This was a continuous process that would last for 8, sometimes 12 hours. And Ketil would stand on a raised platform behind the furnace. He would add a layer of charcoal through the top. Then he would wait. His 2 apprentices, young boys named Finn and Rolf, worked the bellows. They were made of wood and leather with an iron nozzle or tuyere that fed air into the base of the fire. They had to pump in a steady, constant rhythm. One pushed down as the other pulled up. The roar of the fire was immense. It was a man-made dragon. After about 15 minutes, Kettle would add the first charge of ore on top of the glowing charcoal. Then another layer of charcoal, then more ore. He kept this up all day. Charcoal, ore, charcoal, ore. The ratio was critical, roughly 1 part ore to 1 part charcoal by weight. Too much ore would cool the fire. Too much charcoal would waste precious fuel. He read the flame coming out of the top of the furnace. A bright, roaring flame was a good sign. A dark, smoky flame meant trouble. Inside the furnace, a chemical reaction was taking place. The burning charcoal produced carbon monoxide gas. This gas stripped the oxygen away from the iron oxide in the ore, leaving behind metallic iron. The temperature inside reached over 1,100 degrees Celsius. The iron never fully melted. Instead, it formed into a spongy, porous mass called a bloom. The other impurities in the ore, silica, alumina, manganese, did melt. They formed a liquid slag that dripped down to the bottom of the furnace. Every hour or so, Ketil would take a long iron bar and poke it through the opening at the bottom. He would break the crust of cooled slag and let the molten river flow out. It glowed orange and hissed as it hit the damp earth. This was essential. If the slag was not tapped, it would build up and drown the fire. At the end of the long day, exhausted and covered in soot, they would stop adding fuel. They let the furnace cool slightly. Then, with heavy tongs and long iron bars, they would break open the front of the furnace. They reached into the glowing heart and pulled out the bloom. It was a shaggy, ugly lump of iron and trapped slag weighing maybe 15 pounds. It glowed bright orange and shed sparks. It was not yet iron, not in a usable form, but it was a victory. They had tamed the beast for another day. They had turned rock into metal. Number 15. The bloom was not steel, but a promise of it. The bloom that came out of the furnace was a mess. It was a porous, cinder-like lump of iron mixed with a great deal of slag. For a young smith like Orm, working in Burka around 865, this was where the real back-breaking labor began. The process of turning this ugly bloom into usable iron was called consolidation. Immediately after being pulled from the furnace, while still glowing hot, Orm and his master would place the bloom on a large, flat stone. They would attack it with heavy sledgehammers. This was not about shaping, it was about compression. With each blow, the bloom would spit and spray liquid slag. It was dangerous work. The hot, glassy slag could cause terrible burns. They hammered the spongy mass together, trying to squeeze out as much of the non-metallic junk as possible. They were forcing the separate particles of iron to weld themselves together into a more solid block. After this initial hammering, the bloom was still not pure. It had to be worked in the forge. Orm would use an axe to cut the still hot bloom into smaller, more manageable pieces. He would take one of these pieces, maybe 5 pounds, and put it into his own forge fire. He would heat it to a bright yellow, almost white heat. This was a welding heat. He would bring it to the anvil and hammer it furiously. He was not trying to make a shape yet. He was driving out more slag. He would then fold the hot metal over on itself and hammer it back down, welding the 2 layers together. He would heat it again, fold it again, and weld it again. He might do this 8 or 10 times. Each fold and weld helped to homogenize the iron, spreading out the carbon content more evenly. It also continued to squeeze out the stubborn, trapped slag. The iron bar would get smaller and denser with each cycle. The structure of the metal was being refined. What started as a crumbly lump was becoming a tough, fibrous bar of wrought iron. This process took hours for each small piece of the original bloom. It was some of the hardest, least glorious work a smith did. It required a strong back and a great deal of fuel. By the end of it, the original 15-pound bloom might yield only 5 or 6 pounds of usable iron bar stock. More than half the weight was lost as slag and scale. This refined iron was low in carbon. It was tough and ductile, but it would not hold a sharp edge. It was the raw material for axe bodies, for nails, for cooking pots, and it was the foundation upon which a great sword would be built. Orm knew that the quality of his final blade depended entirely on how well he did this first, brutal job of cleaning the iron. A hidden pocket of slag in the core of a sword could create a weak spot, a place where the blade would snap in the heat of battle. There were no shortcuts. The promise of steel had to be earned with sweat and a heavy hammer. Number 14, some iron was made better by its own impurities. In the region of Gotland around 920, a smith named Thorleif had a reputation. The patterns on his sword blades were unusually bright. The swirling lines of light and dark metal seemed to leap out from the steel. Other smiths tried to copy his work using the same techniques of twisting and welding, but their patterns were always more subtle, more muted. Thorleif's secret was not in his hammer, but in his choice of materials. Thorleif had learned from his father that not all bog iron was the same. The ore from a certain marsh, a place he kept secret, produced a different kind of iron. When smelted and worked, this iron had a particular quality. It was very resistant to corrosion, and when forged into a pattern-welded blade and etched, it turned a bright, silvery white. He did not know the reason for this. He did not know that the groundwater in that specific bog was rich in phosphates, and the resulting iron had a high phosphorus content. All he knew was that it worked. Modern science understands this process. Phosphorus in iron acts as an etchant resistor. When a finished blade is exposed to a mild acid like vinegar or sour milk, the acid eats away at the surface of the metal. It darkens the steel and the regular iron, but it affects the phosphoric iron much less. This creates a powerful visual contrast between the layers. The phosphoric iron stays bright, while the other metals turn gray or black. Thorleif would deliberately use this special iron in his pattern-welded billets. He would forge a bar of his phosphoric iron and a bar of regular low-carbon iron. He would weld them together, fold them, and weld them again, creating a billet of many alternating layers. He would then use this high-contrast billet as one of the rods in his sword core. When he twisted it together with rods made of steel and plain iron, the final pattern was a complex mix of bright silver, gray, and black. This was a trade secret. He would even trade for this specific ore if he ran out. Other smiths might have stumbled upon similar ores, but Thorleif made it a central part of his craft. He understood that an impurity, something that could make Iron brittle, if present in too high a concentration, could also be an asset. It was a tool to be used. He was not just a craftsman, he was a material scientist in his own way. He learned through observation, through trial and error over generations. He saw a strange property in a batch of iron and did not discard it. Instead, he figured out how to use its unique character to make his work stand out. His secret was not a magical technique, but a deep understanding of the subtle variations in the very earth he worked with. Number 13, good steel, was worth more than gold and often harder to find. The ability to make steel was what separated a good smith from a great one. Steel is simply iron with a small amount of carbon added, usually between 0.3% and 1.5%. This small addition makes the metal significantly harder and allows it to be hardened and tempered. For a young smith named Hastein working near the mouth of the Goda-Alv River around 950, getting good steel was a constant struggle. There were two main ways to get it. The first was to make it himself. This process was called carburization. Hastein would take his best bars of wrought iron, the ones he had so carefully refined from the bloom. He would cut them into small pieces. Then he would take a clay pot or build a small box out of clay slabs. He would pack the iron pieces inside this container, layering them with a source of carbon. This could be charcoal dust, but he also used crushed animal bone, hooves, and scraps of leather. He believed these materials added their own spirit to the steel. He would seal the clay container as tightly as possible. Then he would place it in the deepest part of his forge. He would build up the fire around it and keep it at a high, steady heat for a very long time, sometimes for 2 or 3 days. The heat had to be just right. Hot enough for the carbon to migrate into the surface of the iron, but not hot enough to melt it. Over this long period, the iron would absorb carbon from the surrounding material. This was a slow, inefficient process. It used a huge amount of charcoal, and the results were unpredictable. When he broke open the cooled clay box, he might find good steel. Or he might find that the carbon had not penetrated deeply, leaving him with an iron bar with only a thin steel skin. Sometimes the heat was too high, and he would open the box to find a melted, ruined lump. The steel he did make, known as cementation steel, was precious. He would use it only for the cutting edges of his finest axes and swords, but there was another way. Hastein often dealt with traders whose ships put in at the nearby harbor. These men traveled far. Some came from the west, from the lands of the Franks, or they sometimes brought with them blades or bars of Frankish steel, which was known for its quality. Others came from the east, having traveled the river routes through Gardariki. They brought silks and silver, and sometimes they brought something even more valuable, cakes of crucible steel, what they called bulet or woots. This steel came from even farther away, from India or Central Asia. This imported steel was a marvel. It was made by melting iron with carbon-rich materials in a sealed crucible. It was uniform, high in carbon, and had a beautiful internal structure. A. Smith did not have to make this steel. He only had to shape it. Of course, it was incredibly expensive. A single small ingot of this eastern steel could cost as much as several cows. Hastein could rarely afford it. But when he could, it was a special occasion, he would save it for a commission from a powerful chieftain. The existence of these trade routes meant that a Viking smith was not entirely limited by his local resources. The best materials from across the known world could, for a price, end up in his forge. This access to foreign steel, as much as the local bog iron, was a key ingredient in the making of the finest Viking weapons. Number 12, the hammer and anvil spoke a language of their own. Ragnar was an old smith in Trondheim around the year 980. His hands were gnarled and scarred, but they held a lifetime of knowledge. To an outsider, his workshop was a chaotic mess of tools, but to Ragnar, each tool had a purpose and a story. He believed the most important secrets were not in the fire or the metal, but in the tools that shaped them. His hammers and his anvil were not just lumps of iron. They were his partners. His main anvil was not the large horned shape we think of today. It was a simple square block of iron set into a massive log of oak buried deep in the dirt floor of his shop. This gave it immense stability. It would not bounce or shift under the heaviest blows. The solid mass absorbed the shock, reflecting the hammer's energy back into the workpiece. He also had a collection of smaller anvils, stakes of various shapes that could be set into the main log. Well, he had a small, rounded one for shaping axe sockets and a thin, tapered one for finishing the points of spearheads. He had more than a dozen hammers. Each was different. There were heavy sledgehammers for his apprentice to use when consolidating blooms. There were cross-peen hammers with one face flat and the other a wedge shape for drawing out the metal, making it longer and thinner. There were ball-peen hammers for riveting. His favorite hammer, the one he used for the delicate work of setting the welds on a sword, was lighter with a slightly rounded face. He had made the handle himself from ash wood, soaking it in linseed oil. The handle was not perfectly straight. It had a subtle curve that fit his grip perfectly. He knew its balance, its weight, its voice. He also had a vast array of tongs. A smith needed tongs to hold hot metal, but one pair was not enough. The tongs had to grip the workpiece securely without marking it. Ragnar had tongs with flat jaws for holding bars, tongs with rounded jaws for holding rods, and tongs with small, delicate jaws for holding knife blades. He had dozens of them, hanging on the wall of his shop. If he had a piece of an unusual shape, he would simply forge a new pair of tongs specifically for that job. The tongs were an extension of his hand, allowing him to reach into the heart of the fire. The language spoken between these tools was one of vibration and sound. When Ragnar was forge welding, he listened. A good, solid weld made a high, clear, ringing sound with each hammer blow. A bad weld with slag trapped inside made a dull, flat thud. The anvil told him if the weld was clean. The hammer told him how the metal was moving. He could feel the resistance of the steel through the handle. He knew when it was becoming too cold and stiff, and when it was soft and plastic. This was a physical conversation. It was a knowledge held in the muscles and ears, not in words. A young smith had to spend years just learning to listen to what the tools were telling him. Number 11, fire was not one color, but 100. Solveig was a rarity. She was a smith in a world of men. She had learned the craft from her father on the island of Åland around 900. Her specialty was not swords, but smaller, intricate pieces, brooches, pendants, and fine knives. Because her work was delicate, she had developed an incredible sensitivity to the temperature of her forge. She could not rely on brute force. Everything depended on precise heat control. She judged the temperature of the metal not by any instrument, but by its color. This was a skill that took a lifetime to master. She knew that as steel heated, it would go through a predictable spectrum of colors. It began at a dull, barely visible red around 600 degrees Celsius. This was too cold for any real forging. As the heat increased, it turned to a cherry red, then a bright red. At around 900 degrees, it was a bright orange, a good temperature for general forging and shaping. For the critical process of forge welding, a much higher heat was needed. Solveig would watch the metal go from orange to a bright yellow. Then, just as it approached a blinding white, she would see the first signs of sweating. Tiny sparks would begin to dance on the surface of the metal. This was the moment the surface was beginning to liquefy. This was the perfect welding temperature, around 1,200 to 1,300 degrees Celsius. She had only a few seconds to get the metal from the fire to the anvil and strike the first blow. Like, if she waited too long, the steel would burn. It would crumble under the hammer, a shower of brilliant white sparks signaling its ruin. The carbon that gave it strength would be burned away. This skill was even more critical during the heat treating process. After a blade was shaped and polished, it had to be hardened. Solveig would heat the blade evenly to a specific temperature, what modern smiths call the critical temperature. For the simple steels she worked with, this was around 750 to 800 degrees. She knew this temperature by its color. a specific shade of cherry red, visible even in the dim light of the forge. She would watch the shadows moving within the steel itself. When the color was perfectly uniform with no darker spots, she would plunge it into the quench. After hardening, the blade was brittle as glass. It had to be tempered to give it toughness. She would do this by carefully heating the blade again, but to a much lower temperature. She would first polish the hardened steel so it was bright and clean. Then she would gently heat it, often by placing it on a larger bar of hot iron. As the temperature rose, a thin oxide layer would form on the polished surface, creating a new set of colors. It started with a faint straw yellow, then moved to a dark straw, a brown, a purple, and finally to a dark blue. Each color represented a specific temperature and a specific balance of hardness and toughness. For a knife that needed to hold a fine edge, she would stop when it reached a light straw color around 220 degrees. For a tool that needed to be tougher, like a small chisel, she might let it go to a dark blue. She was reading the language of the heat. It was a silent visual language, but it was the most important one a smith could know. Number 10, the twist was the soul of the blade. Einar, a smith working near the Trelleborg fortress in Denmark around 980, was obsessed with patterns. For him, the pattern-welded core of a sword was not just for strength. It was the blade's identity. The most fundamental technique for creating these patterns was twisting. He would begin with the basic building blocks rods. He would forge several small square rods. Some would be from the steel he had made. Others would be from soft, refined iron. He might even have a rod of layered steel and iron, a billet he had already folded several times to create simple parallel lines. The key was the contrast between the metals. He would take 3 or 4 of these rods and bundle them together. He might arrange them in a simple checkerboard pattern, steel, iron, steel. He would heat the bundle in the forge to a welding heat and hammer them into a single solid square bar. Now, the different metals were fused together, but their distinct identities were preserved within the bar. This bar was the canvas, the twisting was the brushstroke. Einar would heat the center of the bar to a bright orange yellow. He would clamp one end in his vise. With a heavy set of tongs, he would grip the other end and begin to turn. The hot plastic metal would twist like a rope. He had to be precise. A loose, slow twist would create a wide, lazy pattern. A tight, fast twist would create a fine, intricate pattern. He could twist the entire bar in one direction. Or he could heat a section, twist it, let it cool, then heat the next section and twist it in the opposite direction. This would create a stunning chevron or herringbone pattern when the blade was finished. After twisting, the bar was no longer square. It was a ridged, spiraled rod. Einar's next step was to forge it back into a square shape. He would carefully hammer on the high points of the twist, flattening the bar. This was a delicate operation. If he hit it too hard, or if the heat was wrong, he could distort the pattern he had just created. As he hammered the bar flat, the internal spiraled layers were compressed. The simple lines of the original rods were transformed into complex, star-like or circular shapes when viewed from the end of the bar. He might take several of these twisted bars and weld them together side by side to form the core of the sword. The final blade might have 2, 4, or even more twisted rods running down its center. Each rod could be twisted differently. The combinations were nearly endless. This was how a smith expressed his artistry. The twist was not just a mechanical process. It was a way to create beauty and complexity deep within the heart of the steel. It was a secret that was only revealed at the very end, when the blade was polished and etched, and the soul of the metal was finally laid bare. Number 9, the edge was a different beast altogether. A pattern-welded core was beautiful and strong. It gave a sword the flexibility to absorb the shock of impact, but it could not hold a truly sharp edge. The soft iron in the core would dull quickly. For that, a smith needed pure, hard steel. For Harold, a smith in Uppsala around 960, attaching the cutting edge was the most nerve-wracking part of making a sword. He would start with the finished pattern welded core. It would be a thick rectangular bar with the intricate twists already forged inside it. He would then forge two separate bars of his best high carbon steel. These would be the edges. The quality of this steel was paramount. He had either made it himself through the long carburization process or traded for it at great cost. It was his most valuable material. There were several ways to attach the edges. Harold's preferred method was to forge the core so that it had a long wedge-shaped tang running down its center. He would then forge a groove or a deep up into one side of each of the steel edge bars. He would fit these grooved bars onto the central tang of the core, one on each side like a cap. The result was a sandwich, with the patterned core in the middle and the hard steel edges on the outside. Getting these three pieces to weld together perfectly was a supreme test of skill. Harold would bind the assembly together with iron wire. He would then apply a flux, a powder of sand and other secret ingredients along the seams. The flux helped to clean the surfaces of the metal and prevented oxidation, allowing for a clean weld. He would place the entire assembly into the forge. He watched the heat with an eagle's eye. He had to bring the entire bar, core, and edges up to a perfect welding heat. But the core and the edges might heat at different rates. If he overheated the high carbon steel edges, he would burn the carbon out, ruining their ability to be hardened. If he did not get the core hot enough, the weld would not take. When the color was a brilliant, sparkling white-yellow, he would pull it from the fire. He and his apprentice would move with practice speed. On the anvil, he would use light, rapid hammer blows. He started in the middle of the blade and worked his way out to the ends. He was not trying to shape the blade yet. He was only trying to set the welds to fuse the three pieces into one solid whole. He would listen for the clear ring of a good weld. He would have to reheat and hammer the blade several times to ensure the welds were solid along the entire length. Only after he was certain that the edges were permanently joined to the core would he begin the process of forging the blade to its final shape, drawing out the point, creating the taper from the hilt to the tip, and establishing the bevels of the edges. It was a moment of high risk. A single failed weld, a single spot of trapped slag could mean that the weeks of work he had already invested in the patterned core were all for nothing. The beauty of the core was meaningless without the deadly bite of the steel edge. Number 8. The blade's groove was not for blood. Many Viking swords had a long, shallow channel running down the center of the blade, from the guard almost to the tip. This is often called a blood groove, with the myth being that it was designed to help blood flow out of a wound. For a smith like Sigurd, working on the Isle of Man around 940, this feature had a much more practical and sophisticated purpose. He called it the fuller. Forging a fuller into a blade was a deliberate and skillful process. It was not simply ground out after the blade was shaped. It was hammered in. Sigurd would use special tools for this. He would have a bottom fuller, which was a rounded or wedge-shaped tool that fit into the hardy hole of his anvil. He would also have a top fuller, a similar shaped tool with a handle which he would hold in his hand. After the blade was forged to its basic shape, while it was still hot, he would lay it on the bottom fuller. He would place the top fuller on the blade directly above the bottom one. His apprentice would then strike the top fuller with a sledgehammer. With each blow, the two rounded tools would press into the hot steel, creating the groove. Sigurd would move the blade along section by section, ensuring the fuller was straight and of a consistent depth. He would have to do this for both sides of the blade. The purpose of the fuller was twofold. First, it lightened the blade. By removing material from the center, Sigurd could make the sword significantly lighter without sacrificing much of its width or its structural integrity. A lighter sword was a faster sword. It could be wielded for longer without tiring the warrior. It was a matter of balance and performance. A heavy, clumsy sword was a liability. The fuller allowed for a wide, intimidating-looking blade that was still nimble and responsive in the hand. Second, the fuller added stiffness. This seems counterintuitive, but it works on the same principle as an I-beam in construction. The geometry of the fuller, with its thick ridges on either side, created a cross-section that was more resistant to bending than a simple flat bar of the same weight. This meant the blade could be made thinner and therefore lighter while still remaining stiff and strong enough to withstand the rigors of combat. Creating a perfectly straight and even fuller was a sign of a master smith. It was much more difficult than forging a simple, flat blade. Any mistake would be immediately visible. A wavy or off-center fuller was the mark of an amateur. For Sigurd, the fuller was a piece of functional engineering. It was a clever solution to the problem of making a weapon that was both strong and fast. It had nothing to do with blood. It had everything to do with physics. In number 7, the final shape was revealed by abrasives, not fire. And the work of the forge was done. The blade was shaped. The edges were welded on. The fuller was hammered in. But the sword was not finished. It was black with fire scale and covered in hammer marks. Its inner beauty and its sharp edge were still hidden. For a smith like Ulf, working in the newly established city of Dublin around 910, the next stage was one of patience and grinding. This was a slow, laborious process. Ulf would have a large grinding stone, probably made of sandstone, mounted on a wooden frame. It might be turned by a hand crank, a job for an apprentice. He would sit for hours carefully grinding the surface of the hardened blade. He had to keep the stone wet with water to prevent the blade from overheating. If the blade got too hot during grinding, it would ruin the temper, softening the edge he had worked so hard to create. He would use the large wheel to establish the primary bevels of the edge and to remove the deep scale and hammer marks. He had to be careful to grind both sides evenly to keep the blade straight and balanced. This stage alone could take days of work. After the rough grinding, he would move to smaller handstones of different grits. He would sit with the blade across his lap, rubbing it with a wetted stone. He might start with a coarse slate and move to a finer, smoother stone, perhaps a type of schist. He was slowly removing the scratches left by the previous, coarser abrasive. With each finer stone, the surface of the blade became smoother and more reflective. It was during this polishing stage that the pattern welding would finally begin to appear. The faint ghostly lines of the twisted core would emerge from the gray steel. To make the pattern truly stand out, Ulf would use a mild acid. He might use vinegar or the fermented juice of certain berries, or even just sour whey. He would rub the acidic liquid onto the blade and let it sit. The acid would eat away at the different metals at slightly different rates. It would darken the steel and the plain iron, but the phosphoric iron, if he had used any, would remain bright. This etching process was the final revelation. It was the moment the serpent in the steel was truly born. The final step was the sharpening. He would use his finest grained stones for this. He would work carefully along the edge, creating a sharp, durable secondary bevel. He would check the sharpness with his thumb, a dangerous but common practice. The blade was then cleaned and oiled with animal fat or beeswax to protect it from rust. This final stage of the work required a different kind of skill from forging. It was not about heat and force, but about patience, precision, and a delicate touch. A poorly ground and polished blade, no matter how well it was forged, would be an ugly and inefficient weapon. Number 6. The blade was not born until it survived its baptism. The blade was polished and ready for its final, most critical trial, the quench. This was the step that gave the steel its hardness. It was a moment of extreme stress for the metal, and it could make or break the entire project. For a smith named Brand, working in the Orkney Islands around 880, this was the most magical and terrifying part of the process. After weeks of work, Brand had a finished sword blade. It was beautiful, but it was soft. The steel edge was in an annealed or unhardened state. He could bend it, it would not hold a sharp edge. To harden it, he had to heat it to its critical temperature and then cool it with shocking speed. He would do this at dusk. The dim light made it easier to see the true color of the hot steel. He would place the long blade into a specially built forge, long and narrow, to heat it as evenly as possible. He would watch it intently as the color changed. He was looking for that perfect, even, cherry red glow around 750 degrees Celsius. If any part of the blade was too hot or too cold, it would warp or crack during the quench. Beside the forge was his quench tank. This was usually a long wooden trough filled with a liquid. The choice of liquid was a closely guarded secret of many smiths. The simplest and most common was water, but water was a very harsh and fast quenchant. It cooled the steel so rapidly that it created immense internal stresses, and the blade had a high chance of cracking or warping dramatically. To slow down the quench and reduce the risk, many smiths used other liquids. Oil, perhaps whale oil or a thick vegetable oil, was a popular choice. It cooled the steel more slowly than water, leading to less stress. Brine or salt water was another option. It actually cooled the steel faster than fresh water in the initial phase, which could be useful for certain types of steel. And legends and sagas speak of more exotic quenchants like the blood of certain animals or even urine, with the belief that the spirit of the substance would enter the blade. While these may have been used ritually, their practical effect was mostly related to their cooling rates, similar to brine. Brand chose oil for his finest blades. He would stand over the forge, the red-hot blade illuminating his face. When the color was perfect, he would move in one swift, fluid motion. He would lift the blade from the fire and plunge it, edge first, into the long trough of oil. There would be a violent hiss, a plume of acrid smoke, and the oil might even flash into flame for a moment. He had to plunge it straight down without any sideways motion to minimize the chance of warping. He would hold it there until the blade stopped glowing. Then he would pull it out. The beautiful polished surface was now black again. He would tap it gently. The soft hud of the annealed blade was gone. Now it made a high, clear ping. It was hard. He would take a file and run it along the edge. Before the quench, the file would have bitten into the steel. Now it skated across the surface without leaving a mark. The blade had survived its baptism by fire and oil. It was now hard, but it was also dangerously brittle. Number 5, hardness alone was a fatal flaw. The blade that came out of the quench was as hard as a file, but it was also as brittle as glass. If struck against a shield with force, it would not bend, or chip it would shatter. This hardness was useless without toughness. The final heat treatment tempering was the secret to finding the perfect balance. This was a process of controlled softening. Sten, a smith working in the bustling trade center of Staraya Ladoga around 895, was a master of the temper. He knew that the color of the steel could tell him its exact state. After the quench, he would first have to clean the blade again. He would take a smooth stone and some sand and polish a section of the blade, usually near the hilt, until it was bright, bare metal again. This polished section was his window into the steel. He would then apply a gentle, controlled heat. He never put the blade back into the main forge for this. The heat was too intense and difficult to control. Instead, he would heat a thick bar of iron until it was glowing red. He would then lay the hardened blade on top of this hot bar. The heat would slowly conduct from the bar into the blade. Sten would watch the polished section of the blade with total concentration. As the steel heated up, a thin layer of oxide would form on its surface. The thickness of this oxide layer determined its color. At around 220 degrees Celsius, it would turn a pale straw yellow. This indicated a very hard but still brittle temper, suitable for a razor. As the heat crept higher, the color would shift to a dark straw, then to a brown, then to a rich purple, and finally to a deep blue or gray. Each color represented a slightly higher temperature and a softer but tougher state of the steel. For a sword, Sten wanted a combination of properties. He needed the edge to be very hard, to stay sharp, but he needed the spine of the blade to be softer and tougher, to absorb impact. He could achieve this with clever heat control. He might heat the thick spine of the blade more than the thin edge. As the heat crept from the spine towards the edge, he would see a rainbow of temper colors form. The spine might be blue or purple, while the edge was still a light straw or brown. This technique, called differential tempering, created a blade with the best of both worlds. When the colors reached the exact shades he wanted, he would pick up the blade and let it cool in the air. The process was stopped. The internal structure of the steel was now locked in this tempered state. He had traded a small amount of the extreme hardness for a great deal of toughness. The blade would now hold a sharp edge. but it would also be able to flex and bend without breaking. This final, subtle application of heat was what transformed a brittle piece of steel into a resilient, effective weapon. It was a secret that required a delicate touch and a perfect eye for color. Number 4, the grip was where the man and the metal met. A blade, no matter how masterfully forged, was just a piece of metal without a hilt. The hilt was the interface between the weapon and the warrior. It provided grip, balance, and protection. For a smith like Ivar working in Jorvik, modern-day York, around 930, creating the hilt was an art form in itself, often involving several different craftsmen. The foundation of the hilt was the tang. This was the long, narrow extension of the blade that the hilt components would be mounted on. The tang was softer, unhardened steel. Ivar would forge it as part of the blade, a single, continuous piece. The end of the tang was usually threaded or left thin enough to be peened over. The first piece to be fitted was the lower guard. This was a thick piece of iron or sometimes bronze. It was forged with a rectangular hole in the center that matched the shape of the tang. Ivar would file this hole carefully until the guard was a tight, snug fit. The guard protected the user's hand from sliding down onto the blade and could also be used to block an opponent's blade. Next came the grip itself. This was almost always made of organic material that has rarely survived in the archaeological record. The most common material was wood. A piece of hardwood like oak, ash, or maple would be selected. It would be split in two, and each half would be carved out to fit around the tang. The two halves would then be glued together, forming a solid wooden core around the metal. This core was then often tightly wrapped. Linen, cord, leather strips, or even fine wire made of silver or copper could be used. This wrapping provided a secure, comfortable gripping surface. Some high-status swords had grips made of bone, antler, or even walrus ivory. The final piece was the pommel. This was a heavy piece of metal at the very end of the hilt. Like the guard, it was pierced to fit over the end of the tang. The pommel served two crucial purposes. First, it acted as a counterweight. A sword blade is naturally front-heavy. The heavy pommel shifted the point of balance closer to the hand, making the sword feel lighter and more agile than its actual weight would suggest. A well-balanced sword was a joy to wield. An ill-balanced one was a clumsy club. Second, the pommel secured the entire hilt assembly. Once the guard, grip, and pommel were in place, Ivar would heat the very tip of the tang that protruded through the pommel. With a small hammer, he would peen this hot, soft metal over, riveting it down onto the pommel. This locked everything together into a single, solid unit. There were no screws or pins. The entire hilt was held together by this one permanent connection. Viking-age sword hilts were often beautifully decorated. The guard and pommel could be inlaid with silver, copper, or brass wire, often in intricate geometric or animal-style patterns. The pommel itself could be a complex multi-part construction of different metals. This decoration was not just for show, it was a display of wealth and status. A finely decorated hilt on a masterfully forged blade was the ultimate symbol of a powerful warrior. Number 3. A blade was only as good as its sheath. A fine sword spent most of its life not in a warrior's hand, but at his side, protected by its scabbard. A scabbard was not just a container, it was a vital piece of equipment that protected the blade, protected the owner, and allowed the weapon to be carried and drawn effectively. Making a scabbard was a specialized craft, and a smith like Thorgils, living in Birka around 870, would often work with a woodworker and a leather worker to create the final product. The core of the scabbard was made of wood. Two thin lathes of a lightweight wood like linden, poplar, or alder would be carved to match the exact shape of the blade. The inside of each piece would be hollowed out so that when they were put together, they formed a perfect, close-fitting cavity for the sword. It was important that the fit was snug, so the blade did not rattle, but not so tight that it was difficult to draw. The inside of this wooden core was often lined. The most common lining was fleece, or a similar woolly fabric. This was not for padding. The natural lanolin in the wool helped to keep the blade lightly oiled, protecting the precious steel from the constant threat of rust. This simple, clever feature could dramatically extend the life of a sword, especially in the damp northern climate. Once the lining was in place, the two wooden halves of the scabbard would be glued together. This created a light but rigid case for the blade. This wooden core was then almost always covered. The most common covering was leather. A piece of vegetable tanned leather would be soaked in water to make it pliable. It would be stretched tightly around the wooden core and stitched up the back. As the leather dried, it would shrink, creating an incredibly tight and durable skin. The scabbard needed a way to be worn, a complex system of straps and buckles, often attached to a decorated slide on the scabbard itself, allowed it to be slung over the shoulder or attached to a belt. This suspension system was designed to hold the sword at the correct angle for a smooth, fast draw. Finally, the scabbard was finished with metal fittings. A metal chape, made of iron, bronze, or even silver, was fitted to the tip of the scabbard. This protected the fragile wooden point from being damaged if it was dragged on the ground. At the top of the scabbard, a metal locket or throat piece provided reinforcement for the opening. For a high-status sword, these fittings could be elaborately decorated, matching the style of the hilt. The scabbard was a complete system, a combination of wood, wool, leather, and metal, all working together to protect a masterpiece of the smith's art. A warrior who neglected his scabbard would soon find his blade ruined by rust and neglect. Number 2, the smith's mark was a promise. Not all smiths signed their work, but some of the very best did. This was not a signature in the modern sense, but a mark, an inlay of a name or a symbol right into the steel of the blade itself. The most famous of these is the Ulfbert inscription, found on a number of high-quality Viking-age swords. For a master smith, perhaps the one who first used this name around the year 850 in the Frankish Rhineland, this mark was a statement of quality. It was a brand. The process of inlaying a mark was incredibly difficult and precise. It had to be done during the forging process. The smith would first forge the blade to its near final shape. Then, using a small, sharp chisel, he would carefully cut the letters or symbols of his mark into the surface of the hot blade. He had to strike the chisel with just the right force. Too light, and the mark would be shallow and indistinct. Too hard, and he could crack the blade. Next, he would take thin iron wire. This wire was often made of a different type of iron, perhaps one that would contrast visually with the blade steel after polishing. He would carefully hammer this wire into the chiseled grooves. The heat of the blade and the force of the hammer would essentially pressure weld the thin wire into the recesses. Then the smith would continue the forging process. He would reheat the blade and hammer the surface smooth. This would fully weld the inlay into place and make it flush with the surface of the blade. The mark was now a permanent, integral part of the steel itself. It was not just etched on the surface, it was set deep within it. When the blade was finally ground, polished, and etched, the inlaid mark would appear in sharp contrast to the surrounding metal. The letters Flipperplut, for example, would stand out clearly. This mark was a guarantee. It told the buyer that this was not an ordinary blade. This was a blade made by a master using the finest materials and techniques. Swords with this mark were highly sought after. They were the pinnacle of the swordsmith's art. The mark was also a risk for the smith. If a blade with his mark on it failed in battle, his reputation would be ruined. It was a promise of performance. This practice shows that there was a concept of brand identity and quality control even 1,000 years ago. A warrior carrying a blade with a famous smith's mark knew he was carrying the best weapon money could buy. It was a tool, a status symbol, and a piece of art all in one. Number 1, the sword was more than metal, it was a story. A sword was the most expensive and prestigious possession a Viking warrior could own. It was a weapon, yes, but it was also so much more. It was a repository of history, an heirloom, and sometimes it was believed to have a spirit of its own. When an old smith like Ulrich, who had been making swords by a fjord in Sogn for 50 years, finished his last blade around the year 1010, he was not just finishing a piece of steel. He was creating a new character for a story. Swords were given names. Famous swords from the sagas have names like Legbiter, Serpent of the Wound, or Chef of War. Giving a sword a name personified it. It became a companion in battle, not just a tool. A warrior would talk about his sword as if it were a living thing. These swords were passed down from father to son, generation after generation. A young man might go to battle carrying the same sword his great-grandfather had carried. The sword connected him to his ancestors. Its nicks and scratches were a physical record of his family's history. It had been present at great victories and had protected his kin in times of peril. To lose such a sword was not just the loss of a weapon, it was a break in the chain of family honor. The smith who made the sword was part of this story. While his name might be forgotten over the centuries, his skill lived on in the blade. The patterns he had so carefully twisted into the core were his legacy. The balance he had achieved with the pommel was his contribution to the warrior's success. The sharp, durable edge he had created was his promise to the man who wielded it. There was often a ritualistic element to the creation and ownership of a sword. Smiths might sing special songs while they worked, believing it would imbue the blade with strength. Runes were sometimes carved onto the blade or the hilt, intended to give it magical properties or to protect its owner. When a great warrior died, his sword was sometimes buried with him, a companion for the journey to the afterlife. In other cases, a sword was killed, bent, or broken to release its spirit so it could not be used by anyone else. The secrets of the Viking smith were not just about metallurgy and technique. The final secret was the understanding that they were not just making objects. They were forging legends. The long, difficult process from digging ore out of a bog to the final polish was all aimed at creating something that would outlive them. The metal had a physical story, a journey from rock to refined steel, and once it was in a warrior's hand, it began a new story, one of battles, of honor, and of a family's history, a story that would be told around the fire for generations to come.